My name is Becky Menendez, and I am an academic innovation specialist with the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning. And I'm going to talk a little bit about creating accessible content in online courses. As a bit of a caveat, accessibility is a really big topic, and I'll share with you what I do know about accessibility, but there's a lot I'm still learning. So if I might not have ready answers to all of your questions, and some of you may know a few things that I don't know, so feel free to jump in and share something if you feel like it would be helpful. Just starting off with a definition of accessibility, I pulled from the web accessibility page on the University of Maryland, Baltimore website. Accessibility is the inclusive practice of ensuring people of all abilities are given equal access to information and functionality. When it comes to digital accessibility, which is what's more relevant in our online courses, I found a short video that does a really good job of giving an overview of what it is and kind of presenting the different types of disabilities we might need to be designing for and what they rely on in order to access digital content. Quick note, this does talk a little bit about building websites and applications, which we're not doing, but it does apply to the digital content students are accessing while they're in our online courses. So I'm going to play this. Hopefully the volume is loud enough. You might have to turn it up on your own devices.
Imagine if 90% of the websites or mobile apps you use today locked you out. Everyone else continues to experience the convenience of mobile banking, the connectedness of social media, and the freedom of online shopping. But for you, they're inaccessible. For the 57 million people with disabilities in the United States, this is their everyday experience. People with visual, auditory, motor, speech, and cognitive disabilities rely on various assistive technologies and alternate methods of interaction to use digital documents, web, and mobile apps. People with visual disabilities may rely on screen readers, braille displays, zoom functions, or high-contrast colors to get value from what's displayed on screen. People with auditory disabilities often rely on captions or transcripts for video content. People with motor disabilities might require speech-to-text software or keyboard-only interactions. People with speech disabilities require a non-vocal means of interaction. And finally, people with cognitive disabilities often require thoughtful and organized layouts with clear direction. Digital accessibility is the practice of making digital documents, web, and mobile apps accessible to everyone, including people with disabilities. Accessible sites and apps are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Building accessible sites or apps can be tricky without the right guidance. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, published by the W3C, is the standard rule set that defines what makes a site accessible. Developers, testers, app owners, and accessibility experts from around the world rely on these standards for proper accessibility testing direction. In fact, many U.S. federal government agency sites and apps are required by law under Section 508 to be accessible. This law includes the WCAG standard. In the U.S. and European Union, WCAG is being adopted across private sector businesses as well. Whether you're following legal requirements or proactively working to make the web a better place, practicing digital accessibility makes a real difference for millions of people. To start making your site more accessible, try the free Axe browser.
And we'll stop at the ad. So that's kind of a really good overview of what digital accessibility is and who it serves. The next thing I wanted to mention briefly is when we think about accessibility, a lot of times we think just about our students with disabilities and how designing accessibility for accessibility helps them. But as one of you mentioned, a lot of the things we can do to make our content accessible actually helps everyone in certain ways. And there's this great website that I've linked here called Web Accessibility Perspectives that has these short videos that shows why designing for accessibility is important for people with disabilities, but it also shows how it benefits other users as well. So I'm going to show you one more quick video before we get into some how-tos as a really good example of this, just to keep in mind.
Web Accessibility Perspectives. Keyboard Compatibility. Not being able to use your computer because your mouse doesn't work is frustrating. Many people use only the keyboard to navigate websites, either through preference or circumstance. Whether it's temporarily limited mobility, a permanent physical disability, or simply a broken mouse, the result is the same. Websites and apps need to be operable by keyboard. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives.
Okay. So when it comes to ensuring accessibility on online courses, there's a couple different places where we can do things to improve the accessibility at different stages. There's things we can do at the design stage when we're planning a course. There's things we can do when we're actually building the course, developing materials, revising the course, and then there's obviously things that you can do like extended time on a test when the course is live. I'm going to be mainly focusing on what we can do when we're developing accessible content. But hopefully we'll have some resources on our website for some of these other areas as well eventually. A quick note, what I'm going to be presenting on is also found in this accessibility checklist for online course development. It's found on this first link in the FCTL website. I'm going to be kind of explaining the guidelines in these different categories. But if you find this checklist, these links to the right actually go into more detail about the best practices and more specifically the step-by-step directions. It's going to be hard for me to explain how to do everything in detail in such a short presentation, but this is where you can find that information. So we'll talk about 8 areas of focus, and these are principles that can be applied across contexts, across platforms to improve accessibility of digital content. So first area is content structure. And those of you who are familiar with the Quality Matters standards, this aligns with Quality Matters standards 8.1 through 8.3. So to the right, you can see this giant block of text, which is kind of difficult to parse. So some of the things that we can do to improve accessibility is use white space, and to chunk our materials, use white space between chunks of related content, break long sections of text into paragraphs, and then also use headings and lists to visually convey structure and hierarchy. So even though this is just dummy text, even just by separating paragraphs, adding headers, adding subheaders, adding list items, I can already get a better sense of how the content is related to other pieces of content, what the structure is, what the hierarchy of importance is, and you know, kind of the outline of the content is. So that alone already helps from a visual standpoint. But the other piece is when you're adding these headings and subheadings, for it to be really effective for someone, say, who's using a screen reader, you'll need to make sure that you're actually using built-in heading styles. So whether you're in Blackboard or Microsoft Word or some other type of text editor, if there's heading styles that you can select and you apply them, that's what's actually going to allow a screen reader to identify that that's a heading. Same thing with lists. You want to make sure you're using built-in list tools rather than typing a list, putting a space, and kind of just manually creating that list so that a screen reader can recognize it as a list. So I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like in a Word document. Second. Okay. So here's an example of what I mean in a Word document. So this is a good example. If I click on these, so you know, I've got a main heading, I've got a subheading here, another subheading, and back to a larger heading, and I've got a list. And when I click on this, I'm in the Home tab, I can see that I actually have a heading 1 style applied to it. When I go down here, it moves to a heading 2 style. I've got another heading 2 style here and a heading 1. And you've got this default blue, you know, color to it and a size. Those can be changed, but the important thing is that they're actually associated with these heading styles. You'll notice I started with heading 1. I didn't start with a heading 2 or heading 3 because I liked the size better, and I moved directly from a heading 1 to a heading 2. I didn't skip any levels. When I click on the list, I can see that it's actually formatted as a numbered list, and this is what I want. Here I have some text that I just wanted to emphasize, and instead of using a heading style to make it look bigger, I used text formatting, just bold and whatever size I needed. This would be a bad example of how to do it. Even though it looks great and you know, someone who's looking at this visually can see the organization of the document, when I click through here, all of this is just this normal text. There's no heading styles associated with them. and a screen reader would not be able to tell that these are headings. It would read everything in order. So why this is important is when a screen reader is accessing a document, they can actually scan just the headings in the document to get a sense of, what are the main headings and the subheadings of the document. And then they can also jump from different sections. So if they have read this document before and they're returning to it, they can jump directly to a subsection very quickly by using these built-in heading styles. Whereas if these aren't set up correctly as heading styles, they're forced to go through everything in order and just kind of speed up, slow down to get to where they need. Showing you a little bit of what this looks like in Blackboard. 1 second. So in Blackboard, if you're wondering what this looks like, is when you edit and you go into the text in the edit mode, and I click on this, I can see that these are the heading styles. I have heading applied, I have subheading 1, I have subheading 2, and so forth. So that is what you do want to see. Here, when I come here, I can see that it's actually formatted as a numbered list. And if I go to my bad example, you can't see the styles. Oh, here, yes, you can. Everything is actually in just a paragraph style. So there are no heading styles applied. So that's kind of what you're wanting to look for when you're actually typing out content in Blackboard and you have an opportunity to add headers and subheaders. Make sure you're using these heading styles. The unfortunate part of Blackboard is you don't get a lot of control unless you know coding over how these look. You can play with a text editor and make them bigger and smaller and things like that, as long as the important thing is that you have the correct heading style applied there so that a screen reader can navigate those. Okay, next we have text formatting. So when you're formatting your text, you need to make sure that it's large enough to read. Avoid large blocks of italics text, simply because when you have large pieces, like a paragraph of italics text, it's difficult to read. Same thing with large blocks of all caps text. It's more difficult to read all capitals than it is to read normal text. And then also avoid underlining. It does affect readability, but the other factor is that it's a visual marker for hyperlinks. So if a student sees an underlined text and they're not sure whether it's a hyperlink they can or should click on, or whether it's just used for emphasis, it can be a little confusing. Use clean and simple fonts. The decorative cursive fonts look really pretty, but they are more difficult to read. Also, you want to kind of limit yourself to 1 or 2 font families. Avoid using images of text. You want to use actual text instead. So I have this image to the right that says, just because you can't read me doesn't mean that I don't have words. If someone's using a screen reader, unfortunately, they don't have access to those words. And even if someone isn't using a screen reader, if they have some kind of visual impairment where they need to zoom in on the screen or the text to be able to read it, and you have text in an image, you try and blow that up, it can become blurry in a way that's going to prevent them from reading that. Avoid blinking and moving text. And then we're on to our next category, so color and contrast. Avoid using color by itself to convey meaning. And this was a really great example of these 2 pie charts here to the right. So this is an example of something that's using color by itself to convey meaning. We've got these 6 categories that correspond to these pieces on this pie graph, and the only way a user can tell which piece corresponds to which label is by being able to identify this color. So what happens, if you look here onto the pie graph on the right, is a person with this specific type of color blindness isn't able to distinguish some of the colors. And so some of these, like the shopping and health categories, look like one giant piece. Same with the auto and food categories. They look like one giant piece, and there's no way to distinguish what's happening. So one thing that you could do to improve this is simply attach labels to these pieces so that users aren't depending on being able to identify the color alone. Something else that some people use is patterns. So maybe diagonal stripes, solid dots. That's another way to distinguish between visual elements. Make sure you're using text color purposefully, not arbitrarily, and avoid large blocks of brightly colored text. So you don't really want to put a whole paragraph of really bright red text, because that affects readability and can be really tiring on the eyes. Okay, color and contrast. So the contrast piece of this is you need to have a certain amount of contrast between your paragraph text in the background and a certain amount of contrast between your heading text in the background. So the accessibility standards ask for a 4.51 to 1 color contrast ratio between paragraph text and whatever background it's against. And then it asks for a 3.1 color contrast between the heading. So they don't need as much contrast because they're bigger. So this example here to the right passes those standards. The paragraph text has 5.74 to 1 ratio, which is above the 4.5. And the heading text here has a 4.86 to 1 ratio, which is above that 3.1. If you're curious how I know that or how you can find that out, there's a lot of tools out there that can check the contrast of colors for you. I use the WebAIM contrast checker, which I can just grab the color of my text, put it in, grab the color of my background, put it in, and it'll tell me whether it passes or fails. There's some Chrome extensions that can actually look at your web page, like in Blackboard, and just tell you where there's problems with color contrast. So here, I don't know if you could tell that subtle difference. This is good. This one actually doesn't pass. It's not too much different, but now I only have 4.29 to 1 ratio with the paragraph text, which is under the 4.5, and a 2.78 to 1 on the header, which is under the 3.1 or 3 to 1 ratio. So this doesn't pass anymore. For links, use descriptive text link or link text instead of a URL. So in this first example, it uses just the URL as the link. And the problem with this, if someone is using a screen reader, it'll sound like this. For a great overview on how to improve the accessibility of your hyperlinks, please visit https://ACCESSI and so forth. It'll actually spell out the entire link letter by letter, which is very cumbersome. Instead, what you want to do is actually select your text, whether it's in Word or a Blackboard, and then, attach the hyperlink to go to where you want it to go. And this way, someone can actually identify what the link is without having to read the entire link letter by letter. The other thing you want to avoid is using link text that would be ambiguous or confusing by itself. So here's an example. Click here for a great overview on how to improve the accessibility of your hyperlinks. The problem with this is that when someone's using a screen reader, they actually have the ability to scan a web page or a document for just the links and decide whether they want to go to those links. So if you have a document full of click here's, there's no way for them to know what that link contains other than visiting the site and seeing what that site was. So you want to make sure you use descriptive link text for your hyperlinks. Tables. Use tables to summarize data, not for layout. So sometimes when you want to put a picture in a certain place and text in a different place, it's really tempting to use a table. Try to avoid doing that. If you have the option to give your tables a caption or a title in Word or in PowerPoint or in Blackboard or other tools that you use, that's going to be helpful. You want to identify any column or row headers you have. So here we have a header row, and in PowerPoint it's designated as a header row. And what this does is when a screen reader reaches this table, it's going to allow them to navigate through these cells in a way that it's a logical order that it reads it in. And they can also, when they're reading, say, the swimming cell, it will also let them know which header or column rows that particular cell is associated with. So it helps them make more sense out of that table. So I have this nice little demo. I'm not going to play it for you now because I really want to make sure that we have time to get through everything, at least on the surface. But we will attach this PowerPoint, and you can kind of see what it sounds like for a screen reader to read through a table and how they navigate that. Again, don't use images of a table. If you have an image of a table that you're wanting to use, go ahead and recreate that into a real table that can be navigated. And if possible, avoid complex tables that have merged cells, because those are very difficult for a screen reader to read. There's some workarounds for that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Images. We've talked about providing alternative text for images. So in Word, in PowerPoint, in Blackboard, often when you add an image, there's a field or an opportunity for you to provide alternative text, and it's almost always a good idea to do so. I'll explain when it's not in a second. Writing alternative text can be a bit of an art form, but the main thing is to consider the purpose of the image. Why have you placed this image in your content? And what would someone who can't see the image need to know about that image to be able to access the same content that a student who can see the image would be able to access? So you're going for conveying content and functionality. It's not always necessary to describe the whole image in detail. So the example here has a well-written alternative text. Herpes labialis, forgive me, dentistry people, if I'm butchering that pronunciation, but herpes labialis of the lower lip. Note the blisters in a group marked by an arrow. So the important things I'm conveying here is that it's herpes labialis, the location of it, and then also that there's this cluster of blisters in a group that we're bringing attention to. What I'm not doing is noting the number of pores that are around the mouth, the fact that the mouth is closed, the fact that this person has a nice smile. It's the content that you really need to convey, and that can change depending on how you're using that image. Sometimes when you're adding an image to Blackboard or PowerPoint or Word, it may adopt the file name as the alternative text. Make sure you go in and change that. You want to avoid redundancy in your alternative text, meaning if I describe this image in detail in surrounding text, or let's say I actually have a caption like this that's associated with the image, I don't need to have the alternative text say the exact same, that's the same thing that's in that caption, or the exact same thing that's in that surrounding text. In that case, I might simply just use herpes labialis as my alternative text. The other thing that you don't need to do is put image of or screenshot of, maybe screenshot of. If somebody's seeing this, they already realize it's an image, so that's just extra things for a screen reader to read. Alternative text should be concise. The reason for this is that some screen readers will stop reading alternative text when it goes beyond 125 characters. So what that means is if you have a complex image like an infographic or a diagram that you just simply can't describe in 125 characters, you might need to find an alternative format for that description. So again, it could be in the surrounding text of the image if that makes sense for your sighted users as well. It could be that you actually describe it in a caption that's associated with the image because you have more flexibility there. Or another way you could do it is create a long description in a Word document and then provide a link to it so that if someone needs that, they can click on that link and access that longer description. Decorative images. So let's say I have a Dentistry 101 course, and on the front page, I've decided that this is the perfect image to introduce my new dentistry course. There's no content I'm trying to convey. There's nothing important about that image. It's just decorative. In that case, it's actually sometimes better to leave that alt text blank or to have an empty alt text tag if you're in a web page, because what that will do is allow the screen reader to jump over that and not waste time reading a description of an image that's not actually important. And then finally, avoid using images of tables or images of text. If you can't avoid text being part of the image, then make sure you're providing that information in the surrounding text or in alternative text or in a long description somehow. If you're dealing with math and science formulas and equations, these need to be readable by screen readers. Wirus, there's other programs, but Wirus is a great one that can convert these formulas into a MathML format, which is readable by a screen reader. If you don't have access to something that can do that, your other option is to provide the formula or the equation as an image and then make alternative text for it. If you don't have the paid version of Wireless, there's a demo version, which I just put the link for, that you can actually build these equations and formulas, and it'll generate that alt text for you, and you can just copy and paste it and put it where you need it. So it's kind of a neat little workaround. For multimedia, video content should have captions or synchronized text transcript. And this is especially talking about video that has action on the screen, where you're demonstrating something, or where it's important that the words are timed to what's happening on the screen. If you have audio only content, or if you have kind of narration on a static PowerPoint, then you can kind of get away with just doing more of a text transcript, because the synchronization isn't as important in that case. Meaningful visual information in a video is conveyed through an audio description. So if I go back here and I'm, recording a lecture for my students, and I say, look at where this arrow is pointing. Do you notice how big that is? And that's the only thing I say. People who can't see that image aren't going to have any idea what I'm talking about. They're going to be missing important information. So best way is when you're giving your lectures and you're describing an image, just to be more descriptive about what's happening in that image, what you're pointing to, what it is they're supposed to be paying attention to. You could also consider maybe providing text-based descriptions of those images in a different way. Captions and transcripts need to be accurate. Auto captioning is wonderful, but sometimes they are not accurate. And if that is an issue, then you may need to go back and correct them if you have access, or provide accurate ones in a different way. Audio and video should be clear. You should be able to hear the audio, see the video pretty clearly. It is recommended, if you're dealing with videos longer than 15 to 20 minutes, to break them into shorter segments. And users should be able to control movement through a presentation, meaning that they should be able to pause, play, scrub backwards, scrub forward, and kind of navigate through that video at their own pace. For technology, interactions need to be keyboard accessible. That means that you should be able to use the tab key to kind of move through different elements on the screen, should be able to use an enter key to hit a button on the screen. If you have a technology or an interaction that is not keyboard accessible, you may need to be prepared to provide that same content or activity in an alternate format, where the student can, access that content or do that practice activity in a different way. Also, for any technology tools you use, it's best practice to provide accessibility statements for that tool to students, maybe in the syllabus or a Start Here section in your course, so that if they need to know what the accessibility features are and how to access them, they can have that information. I've attached 2 examples here. If you just simply do a search for VoiceThread accessibility, it'll take you right to a page that you can link, provide that link to your students. You can also search for VPAD if that doesn't have that kind of accessibility page, and it lists all the functions of the technology and what's accessible and what's not. Okay, I'm going to pause here. I do have a couple slides on software-specific considerations. There's a couple extra things you might need to do in Blackboard, like clearing formatting, and I've got just a few tips here. Reading order, tagging elements are some things, depending on what application you're using, that you may need to think of. But again, this is all kind of located in this checklist with links on what it is you need to do and how to do it. I think we have a few minutes here, so I don't know how many questions you have or how much time there is, but I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
Hey, Becky, it's Isabel.